Hi friends, my name is Nilesh. In this video, we are going to talk about open source software and what benefits do we get by contributing to open source software. So let's get started by looking at what is open source software. If we go into the browser and search for what is open source software or what is open source, we get multiple results and we can start looking at opensource.com. What is the definition of open source software? The term open source refers to something people can modify and share because it's designed publicly in it's publicly accessible. So when it comes to the software specifically, we look at what is open source software. Open source software is software with source code that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. This is quite popular nowadays where many companies, they are promoting their developers to contribute to the open source, and they also integrate with open source projects into their own products. So how can we benefit as developers from contributing to open source? There are different ways in which we can contribute. I have contributed in various ways, and I would like to share different ways in which I find it useful myself to contribute, and I hope that you can also do the same. Initially, when I started looking at open source software, I had this pre-notion or the misconceived interpretation that you had to be a super duper developer to contribute to open source. That's not really the case. There are different ways in which, even if you are not a hands-on developer or even if you are not a very skilled developer, you can still go back and contribute to the open source. Let's look at some of the projects which we can use for making good use of open source software or learning open source software. So the first benefit or the usefulness of open source software that I find is you can look at popular projects, their source code, how they are designed, how they are developed. You can find their roadmap. You can find what are the issues which are there in this project. So let's say Docker as an example. Nowadays, Docker and Kubernetes, these projects are quite popular. These frameworks and tools are very popular. And the source code for Docker as well as Kubernetes is available on GitHub. So let's say I want to learn about how Docker is built. What are the components of Docker or what are the components of Kubernetes? That's one area where I can go and look at the source code of Docker. So I can go here, Docker on the GitHub, and I will be presented with multiple projects which are all linked to the Docker. Docker is not just one project, it contains various sub projects. And we can see here that it is developed in different languages. Like there are components of Docker which are developed in Go, there are things which are developed in Python, Shell, TypeScript, PHP, and others. So I'm trying to learn Go as a programming language. That's another benefit which I see of using open source software or making use of these open source projects. So I don't know much about Go. I just know, let's say, how to get started to write hello world program in Go. And then once I'm familiar with the basic concepts of Go, I want to understand how it can be used in an enterprise software. So I can find a project like Docker, which is developed in Go, and I can find out how Go is used here. So let's say we go to one of these projects. Let's pick up Docker CLI as an example, and I want to see how Go is used here. So let's go to the cmd underscore slash docker, and here we see some Go files or Go code. Let's look at the top level Docker command, which is the implementation of this. And we can see how Go is used here. So this gives me an idea, or it gives me access to the code which is written by, let's say, quite experienced developers, and I can learn quite a lot from this code. This is been in production, used in many places, and because people are contributing to this, multiple developers are contributing to this, over a period of time, it is bound to have quite a good quality of code. So as the project matures, we can see that the maturity of the tooling as well as the features that are available in that particular project, they are quite useful. So I can use this to learn a new, let's say, pattern, new programming language. I can use this as a reference to upskill myself in some of the programming languages or some of the, let's say, specific implementation pattern like architectural pattern, which I want to see a real life example. That is one way we can use open source. The second example is where Let's say I'm skilled enough and I want to contribute to a particular project. So I will take some examples where I myself have gone ahead and contributed to some of the projects. Instead of taking some random example, I will share my experience, how I used open source software or how did I contribute to the open source software. So this was back in 2017, about 3 years back when I started thinking about learning new stuff and contributing back to the community and using open source software myself. And this was one of the first contribution I made. So there is this Ansible role which is used for installing Visual Studio extensions as part of setting up a machine, or if you're setting up new virtual machine or your laptop. This role is helpful in adding Visual Studio Code extensions. And when this role was created, it had the ability just to add new extensions. There was no ability to delete. So I went ahead and requested to the author or the maintainer of this code to provide this ability to delete or to remove an extension. And the response that I got from the author was this particular need was not there. He didn't have this particular requirement, but he was happy to accept the contribution. So I went ahead and I implemented this feature and I contributed back. I raised a pull request. So when you go and contribute back to the project, let's say a particular project which is out there in the GitHub or any other open source repository, there will be certain guidelines which the maintainer of the project would set, saying what code quality checks have to be there, what kind of unit test or integration tests are required. And once we satisfy all those requirements, once we adhere to all those requirements or expectations from the project, we can go ahead and contribute back. We basically raise a pull request, which is a request to merge our code into the repository of the code base which the maintainer is maintaining. So in this case, I went ahead and implemented this feature and added this feature, and this was accepted. You can also see here that there was a note sent to me by the maintainer saying due to the work commitments, he doesn't have enough bandwidth to work on it and he could look at this only during the weekends. So this is a case where the project is not very actively developed, and you can go ahead and you can contribute, you can help the maintainer of this project to add some new features. There are other cases where a project is very actively developed. So let me take an example from one of the recent project which I contributed. This is called as the project TIE, and this helps us to develop or deploy microservices specifically around .NET. And I added a feature here for showing the elapsed time. And this was helpful when you run commands like init, deploy, or undeploy. So these are the different commands which are supported by Project Type. And there was this request. So if you look at the labels, there will be, anytime we have these issues, there will be a label associated with that. So this is how we identify what is the kind of issue. So you see here, if I hover over this issue number 91, it says that it's a type of enhancement and it is a good first issue. So let's go and look at this one in a different window. So this particular project, .NET TIE, currently it has 174 open issues, and we can filter based on the type of issue. So specifically, now we are looking at issue number 91, where I deployed my fix or I fixed that particular issue. And you can see here that uh, there are things which I submitted. So here, if we go down, we can find the commit history and we can find out what were the code files which were deployed or which were committed as part of this. So it helps us to go into a conversation mode, saying the maintainers of the project can say what they feel about this request, what they want to be done. And if I feel, let's say, confident to go ahead and implement this feature, I can pick it up, I can make the changes, and then I can raise a pull request for this. While doing this, I also got to know some of the features related to source control. When we work in an enterprise, maybe we are working in a very small team, and we might have just one or two branches. Whereas when we work in open source, there are multiple developers working at different pace, and we might have a situation where I clone the repository into my local repository. I fork base repository. In this case, project I start working on this, and in the meantime, there are other pull requests which gets merged. So now my repository is out of sync with what is already there on the project repo or the upstream repository. So in this case, when I submit the pull request, there will be a conflict, and I need to then go and then rebase my pull request. So these kind of things, they help you understand the source code management better. They help you understand how different things related to pull request work, and they make you a better developer in a better way. I think it really helps you to understand the concepts around source code management and how you should work in a collaborative manner. So that's another thing I learned quite a lot while submitting these pull requests. And again, this one was accepted. And when the pull request gets merged into the main repository, then you get added as a contributor. So once you start contributing code like this, the benefit is you would see yourself added to these public projects or open source projects as a contributor. And for some people, that can be a very good enhancement to your public profile, saying you are a contributor to one of the most popular open source projects. So let's say you contribute to Docker or you contribute to Kubernetes. It can be quite a good enhancement, or it can be a good added feature to showcase your skills that you're capable of doing this, not just within your organization, but you can also contribute to the community and you can work on projects which are outside of your organization. So apart from contributing to the code, there are other ways in which you can contribute to open source. So let's say you are not so familiar with a particular language, or you don't know how to contribute by means of code. What other means you can contribute? So when we look at these open source projects, many of them, they have documentation. And as the project evolves, you might find that the documentation is not in sync with what the actual project is doing. So let me show you an example where this can be useful. So we can help the open source project by updating the documentation. That's another way I look at it. So in this case, I was using an example or uh, open source documentation for Azure container instances, which helps us to deploy the virtual node workloads on the virtual node. And the sample which was given, or the code steps which were provided in the documentation, they were not matching with some of the changes which happened as part of the deployment, or as part of the changes which were applicable to the Azure container instances. So if you see here, the problem was there are certain tails, which is a property or a feature of Kubernetes, which are applied to the virtual node or virtual kubelet. And in the example, it was saying that we should apply two or three different types of taints. Whereas if we look at the actual virtual node, the taints which are applied, there is only one. So if somebody tried to follow this documentation, he would not be able to deploy the workload because this taint would not match. And basically, this application or this example would not work as is. So in this case, I went ahead, raised a bug for this, and we can see here that in the labels, it is classified as a documentation bug. And then I went ahead and raised a pull request to fix that bug. So if you look at the documentation now, let me show you quickly. So we say Kubernetes AKS and virtual node. This is the documentation I'm talking about, create virtual nodes using portal in the Kubernetes. And if we scroll down, this is the YAML file which has those node selectors and the toleration. So if you look at this toleration here, right now it is showing only one toleration, which is to say there is a key called as virtual kubelet.io in provider this exists in this particular uh, specification. Earlier, it used to have multiple things here, and this is the change which I did. I removed part of the code. So if you look at the commit history, you would find that some of the additional code which was here, I've removed that. So this is another example where we can help the documentation to improve if it is not in line with what the project or the product is doing. The other example I found is similar to this, where there is a discrepancy in the documentation, but you don't know how to fix it. So here is a case where I was using managed identity with a virtual machine scale set, and the documentation was saying something that automatically in the version 1.16 and above, when we create a managed identity, it would have certain characteristics. So when I tried to follow this documentation, again, I had a problem. I could not deploy my application and I raised this bug. So in this case, I don't know what is the solution or how to fix this, but I can still contribute to this project by saying, see, you have a documentation. I am trying to follow the documentation, but it's not in line with what the project is doing. So in this case, you can see that the maintainers, they acknowledge that there is a problem with this and they should go and they should update the documentation. So this is another example where I contributed back to the project by giving a feedback to the project team about their documentation. And we can see that this has been, somebody has gone ahead, updated the document, and it has already been merged into the main documentation. So if anybody follows up this documentation, the updated one, they should not face the same issue. So this way we can contribute back to the community where we face an issue, we don't know what is the solution, but we can still go back and say, I face this issue. If somebody else is facing it, they might as well have a solution. And we might find that solution being recommended by some person who already knows how to fix that issue. Or at least the project team would be aware that this issue exists and they need to fix it. The next one is not exactly related to the bugs, but let's say I'm using a project, using a product, and I request some feature or I require some feature. So this is similar to what I was talking about the first one, where in this ability to delete or remove, I had requested for this feature, and the person or the maintainer did not have the ability or the time bandwidth to work on this. So I went ahead and worked on this. But in this case, let's say I also don't have the bandwidth, but I need a feature. As a user of a product or a project, I'm expecting some feature to be available, or I need some enhancement to be done to an existing feature. So I can go and request for a feature. So in this case, I'm requesting a feature regarding the Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. They have a new feature called as resource view. And in this, I'm asking them to add some feature. And I give my requirement saying this is what I expect. You can see that again from the project team, there is communication with me asking what do I exactly need. So this is another way where we can interact and we can provide feedback to the project team, asking for new features, giving them our inputs. If they are implementing a feature and that is not in line with our expectation, we can again provide our feedback saying, as a user of your project, this is how I'm going to use this feature, and I expect the feature to work in this particular way. So it could so happen that the person who is developing this feature might uh, not be fully aware of how the end users are going to use that feature. And if we give that feedback, it can definitely help the project team to make the project better. The next one is, um, so we looked at the code commits where we contribute to the code, the documentation, enhancements in the documentation, feature request. The other way we can help the open source project is by raising bugs. So here is an example, again related to project I, where I raised a bug. So I was trying to use this project I to deploy and to undeploy or to remove that application from my Kubernetes cluster. And I found out that the undeploy command or the tie undeploy doesn't work as expected. it fails uh, when the deployment is successful. So this is another case where I'm expecting a feature to work as expected, but there is something wrong with the project. I don't know how to fix this, but this is a end user problem, and I'm requesting the project team to fix it. So this is another example which I find useful to communicate back with the project team. The last one, which I think is by creating samples. So many of these projects, they have different capabilities, and not all the capabilities are demonstrated in all the samples, especially the projects which are actively developed and which are adding new features at a very fast pace. So let me take KEDA as an example. KEDA is Kubernetes-based event-driven auto-scaling, and it supports multiple event sources, and it supports multiple languages as well. So the examples which exist on the KEDA, so if we go into the samples, I'm looking at specifically the samples related to KEDA. We see that it has some built-in samples, or the samples which are provided by the KEDA team itself. And maybe me as a user, I might have created a sample and I can contribute it back to KEDA. So here is an example where I built a small project which was using KEDA, and it was built on RabbitMQ with .NET Container. So if I open this link, you can see that it takes it back to my repository. So in this case, there are various examples, but there was no example of how to use RabbitMQ with .NET, and I happen to have an example readily available with me, which I requested the KEDA team to include in the list of examples or samples. So this is another way of contributing to the project. And this way, these are the different ways in which I have personally contributed back to open source, or I have benefited from using the open source project. So let me summarize the different ways in which we can contribute. First and foremost is by going through the open source code and understanding the code to understand some new language or new patterns. Second thing is by contributing to the source code itself. Ourselves, we can contribute to new features. Let me show you one more thing. How do we pick up the features which we want to implement? So let me go to, let's say, the project type project as an example. And if you look at the issues, there are 174 issues which are currently open. And each of these issues will have different labels. So there are labels like bug, cleanup, documentation, duplicate, enhancement, epic, and so on and so forth. So when there is a new programmer or a new developer who wants to start working on this project, it might be a good thing to start with a very simple or a very basic issue. And normally, most of the projects will have this good first issue kind of label, or help required or help wanted kind of label. So these are like easier to develop, or at least from the maintainer's point of view, these are good for first time developers who are trying to contribute to this project. And then we can pick up this issue and we can work on this. So that's the other way where we contribute back by means of code. Then the other option is we contribute to the documentation. So we can fix the discrepancies in the documentation. We can raise bugs if there are any with regards to the documentation. And then we can also build samples. So with that, I almost conclude this video. I hope you find it useful. In case you find this video useful, please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel. Until next time, code with passion and strive for excellence. Thank you. Thanks for watching this video.